April 13th, 1940, 05:17 a.m. The narrow waters of Narvik Fjord, Norway. Rain falls in icy sheets, slashing across the steel decks of HMS Warspite as she glides through the mist-shrouded fjord. The air is thick with the smell of salt and diesel, the distant echo of waves slapping against rock. On the bridge, Captain Victor Alexander Stanley grips the railing, his eyes scanning the dark cliffs ahead. Behind him, the massive 15-inch turrets of the old battleship turn with a groan, their barrels slicing through the fog like the claws of some ancient sea monster. 9 British destroyers trail in her wake, their silhouettes barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Below decks, leading seaman Tom Mallory wipes the condensation from his gun sight. The cold seeps through his gloves as he checks the loading mechanism of the 4.7-inch secondary battery. He thinks of home, of the pub in Portsmouth, the laughter of his mates, the letters from his sister. But here, in this frozen fjord, there is only the deep, rhythmic thrum of the engines and the crackle of the ship's radio. On the other side of the fjord, nestled among the rocky coves, German sailors huddle in their destroyers. They've been here for days, hiding from the Royal Navy, laughing at the idea that a battleship could navigate these tight, twisting waters. A Canal Defender, one officer sneers. Too slow, too big, too old. But now, as the first gray light filters through the storm, a lookout spots a monstrous shape emerging from the fog. The German destroyer Z-18 Hans Ludemann is the first to sound the alarm. Battleship! Battleship in the fjord! The cry ripples through the German fleet. Engines roar to life. Sailors scramble to their stations. But it's too late. Warspite's main guns have already found their range. A deep, guttural roar erupts from Warspite's forward turret. The night splits open as a 15-inch shell screams through the air, trailing smoke and flame. It lands with a thunderous explosion on the deck of Z-12 Erich Giese, tearing the destroyer apart. Metal screams. Men are thrown into the air. The fjord trembles. Captain Stanley watches through his binoculars. Second salvo, target Giese. Make it count. The order crackles over the intercom. The guns fire again. This time, the shell finds its mark. Giese sinks in seconds, swallowed by the churning water. You can almost hear the disbelief on the German ships. The laughter is gone. Now there is only panic. The British destroyers spread out like wolves circling wounded prey. HMS Icarus, Kimberley, and Forester peel off toward the inner fjord, while Warspite continues her relentless bombardment. Each blast from her main guns sends shockwaves rippling across the water, rattling windows in the abandoned houses along the shore. On Warspite's gunnery platform, Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Barnard calculates firing solutions with mechanical efficiency. Range 9,000 yards, target bearing 047, destroyer class. His voice is steady, professional. This is what they trained for, what the old girl was built for. The battleship may be 25 years old, but her guns are as deadly as ever. Another salvo roars out. The shells arc through the gray dawn, their trajectory visible as dark streaks against the clouds. They land on Z-13 Erich Kolner, punching through her thin armor like paper. The destroyer's forward magazine explodes in a brilliant orange fireball that lights up the entire fjord. Burning oil spreads across the water's surface, turning the sea into liquid fire. German sailors dive overboard, their screams swallowed by the chaos. Some swim desperately toward shore. Others cling to debris, watching their ships sink beneath them. The water is so cold it steals your breath in seconds. Aboard Z-9 Wolfgang Zenker, the crew fights back with everything they have. Their 5-inch guns bark defiance, shells splashing around the British destroyers. One round finds HMS Hardy, tearing through her hull, but it's futile. Hardy's commander, Captain Bernard Warburton Lee,
who died in the first battle 3 days earlier, would have appreciated the irony. The Germans are fighting with courage, but courage alone cannot stop a battleship. Warspite's secondary batteries join the fight now. Tom Mallory's gun crew fires in rapid succession, their 4.7-inch shells raking the superstructure of Wolfgang's anchor. Tracer rounds cut through the air like deadly fireworks.
The noise is deafening, a continuous thunder that makes your ears ring, makes your teeth ache. Captain Stanley surveys the carnage through his binoculars. 3 German destroyers are already sinking. 5 more are trapped deeper in the fjord, their escape routes blocked by burning wreckage and the advancing British fleet. The Germans have nowhere to run. You can feel the tide turning. What began as a refuge has become a tomb. At 06:43 a.m., the radio crackles. Warspite, this is Icarus. We have visual on 4 destroyers at Herjolf's Fjord. They're scuttling. Repeat, they're scuttling their own ships. Lieutenant Commander Barnard looks up from his charts. The Germans are destroying their own vessels rather than let them fall into British hands. Z-11 Baron von Arnim, Z-18 Hans Ludemann, Z-19 Hermann Kuhnhe, all being deliberately sunk by their crews. Explosions ripple across the inner fjord as demolition charges tear through hulls. It's a grim calculus. Better to destroy your ship than give it to the enemy. But not all the Germans are surrendering. Z-2 George Thiele makes a desperate run for it, her engines screaming as she attempts to dash past the British destroyers. She nearly makes it. Her wake churns white against the dark water as she races toward the fjord mouth. For a moment, it seems possible. Then Warspite's forward turret speaks again. The shell travels nearly 3 miles in seconds. It strikes George Thiele amidships, the impact so violent it lifts the destroyer's stern out of the water. The ship breaks in 2, both halves sliding beneath the surface within minutes. Survivors scramble onto ice-cold rocks, their lips already turning blue. Tom Mallory watches through his gun sight as Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp, the flagship that torpedoed HMS Hardy 3 days ago, burns in the distance. There's no satisfaction in it, just a grim acknowledgement. War is like this. You do your job, you go home if you're lucky. A new sound cuts through the chaos, the high-pitched whine of an aircraft engine. From Warspite's catapult, a fairy swordfish biplane wobbles into the air, its fabric wings flexing in the wind. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander William Lucy Brown, banks hard over the fjord, his observer scanning for submarines. Intelligence suggests a U-boat might be lurking in these waters. Brown spots it. U-64, running submerged near the fjord entrance. He dives, releasing his depth charges. The water erupts in towering geysers. Oil and debris surface. The U-boat is crippled, forced to the surface, where British destroyers finish the job with gunfire. It's the first U-boat ever sunk by aircraft launched from a battleship. By 08 a.m., the battle is effectively over. 8 German destroyers lie on the fjord bottom or burn at their moorings. Hundreds of German sailors are dead or captured. The Royal Navy has lost 2 destroyers, but the strategic victory is absolute. Norway's northern iron ore port is denied to Germany. Captain Stanley allows himself a thin smile. The old girl proved them all wrong.
Warspite begins her turn, her massive rudder biting into the cold water. Getting out of the fjord is almost as dangerous as coming in. The channel is littered with wrecks now, shallow spots marked by the masts of sunken destroyers jutting above the waves like grave markers. Captain Stanley navigates with painstaking care, relying on local charts and the sharp eyes of his lookouts. One wrong move, and Britain's Queen Elizabeth-class battleship could join the German destroyers on the bottom. On the northern shore, German survivors huddle in groups, guarded by Norwegian resistance fighters and British landing parties. Kapitänleutnant Eric Bay of Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp sits with his head in his hands, his uniform soaked through, his ship gone. He survived the torpedoing of HMS Hardy, only to lose his own command. Around him, young sailors, some barely 18, stare at nothing, their faces blank with shock. They came to Norway expecting glory, expecting easy victories against a weak enemy.
Instead, they found an old British battleship that refused to die. Tom Mallory finally allows himself to breathe. His gun crew secures their weapon, checking for damage, counting ammunition. They're professionals, but the adrenaline is wearing off now, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Someone passes around a tin of cigarettes. Nobody speaks much. What is there to say? They did their job. They survived. Tomorrow, they'll do it again. By 09:30 a.m., Warspite clears the fjord entrance and enters open water. The crew on deck cheers, a ragged, weary sound that carries across the waves. They've done the impossible. They took a battleship into waters where battleships don't belong and came out victorious. The myths about Warspite will only grow from here. The grand old lady, the ship that refused to sink, the battleship with 9 lives. In London, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill receives the news. His response is immediate. This is a great success.
The destruction of these destroyers removes a serious threat to our naval operations. He understands what the public doesn't yet, that naval power isn't just about big guns and thick armor. It's about audacity, about taking calculated risks, about refusing to let the enemy dictate the terms of battle. The German Kriegsmarine is stunned. They lost 10 destroyers at Narvik, half their entire destroyer force, in just 2 battles. The iron ore shipments from Narvik to Germany are cut off. The Norwegian campaign, which started with such promise, is turning into a disaster. Admiral Eric Raeder will later write in his diary, "The loss at Narvik was catastrophic for our surface fleet operations." You can trace a direct line from this battle to Germany's naval strategy for the rest of the war, the cautious deployment of surface ships, the increased reliance on U-boats, the fear of sending capital ships into contested waters.
In the officers' mess, Captain Stanley writes his after-action report by lamplight. His hand moves steadily across the paper, describing angles of approach, firing sequences, enemy dispositions. But he pauses when he reaches the conclusion. How do you capture what happened in that fjord? How do you explain that a ship commissioned in 1915, a veteran of Jutland, the greatest naval battle of the previous war, just proved she could still fight in 1940? He settles on understatement. Warspite performed admirably in difficult conditions. The Admiralty will read between the lines. News of the victory spreads through Britain like wildfire. After months of setbacks, the fall of Poland, the Winter War, the feeling that Germany was unstoppable, finally a clear British triumph. Newspapers run with headlines, "Warspite's Revenge," and 8 Nazi destroyers destroyed. The photographs show the old battleship steaming proudly through rough seas, her battle ensigns flying, her guns still smoking.
For Tom Mallory and thousands like him, there's no parade, no medals ceremony, just a few days of shore leave, letters home that say everything and nothing, and then back to sea. The war is barely 8 months old. There are years of fighting ahead. The Mediterranean, Normandy, the Far East. Warspite will be there for most of it, earning more battle honors than any other British warship in history. But Narvik is special. Narvik is the moment when an old warrior proved that age and cunning could trump youth and aggression. Naval historians will debate the battle for decades. Was it brilliant or reckless? Should a capital ship have risked herself in such confined waters? The answer, perhaps, is that war rarely offers clean choices. Sometimes you take the risk because the alternative is worse. In the cold waters off Norway, German sailors mark the graves of their comrades. Z-series destroyers that once seemed invincible now rest in the deep, their crews scattered to the wind.
Some will fight again in other ships. Others will spend the war in British POW camps, playing cards and learning English, wondering how it all went so wrong so fast. The Norwegian civilians who witnessed the battle will remember it differently, as liberation and occupation colliding in their fjords, foreign powers deciding their fate with guns and steel. For them, Narvik is just the beginning of 5 long years under German rule. Tom Mallory descends into the bowels of the ship one last time before liberty. He runs his hand along the 4.7-inch gun barrel, still warm from the journey home, still bearing the scorch marks of battle. How many shells did they fire? 50? 100? He's lost count. What he remembers instead are faces. The young German sailor thrashing in burning oil, the destroyer breaking in half, the silent prayer he whispered when a shell screamed past their position and missed by yards. In the wardroom, officers pour whiskey and toast absent friends. HMS Hardy and Hotspur won't be coming home, but their sacrifice bought time, drew the Germans into the trap. War is mathematics written in blood. You calculate acceptable losses, necessary risks, strategic gains. It doesn't make it easier. The German prisoners arrive at British camps over the following days, hollow-eyed and silent. They are processed, photographed, assigned numbers. Most are conscripts, farm boys and factory workers who never wanted to fight in Norway's frozen fjords. They write letters home that censors will read, telling mothers and wives they're alive, leaving out the parts about watching their ships die. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler rages at the loss. He demands explanations, scapegoats, promises it will never happen again. The Kriegsmarine reorganizes, reshuffles, restricts. From now on, major surface ships will only sortie with explicit approval from the highest levels. The era of aggressive German naval operations is effectively over after Narvik. The wolf packs of U-boats will carry the naval war forward, while capital ships rust in Norwegian fjords, afraid to face the Royal Navy in open battle. Warspite herself will fight on, 67 more years of service before she's finally scrapped in 1947. She'll bombard Calabria and Salerno, dual Italian battleships in the Mediterranean, support the D-Day landings at Normandy.
She'll be hit by glider bombs, mined, torpedoed, and still refuse to sink. They'll call her the Grand Old Lady, the ship with a life of her own. But none of that matters on this cold April morning in 1940. What matters is that a crew believed in their ship, that a captain trusted his instincts, that an old battleship proved she could still bite. In the narrow waters of Narvik Fjord, HMS Warspite wrote her name into legend, one thunderous broadside at a time. Tom Mallory walks down the gangplank toward Shoreleaf, toward the pub and his mates, and 48 hours of forgetting. Behind him, Warspite sits at anchor, her battle flags furled, her guns silent. But only for now. The war is far from over.